Okay, remember I went through last week and talked about the stats on causation. The standard neoclassical argument is that you've got the money multiplier, which requires you've got to have government money creation first of all to create excess deposits or excess reserves, which are then lent out, and the credit money multiplier operating after that. So you have government money created first and then credit money coming afterwards. Well, you look at the empirical data, you find it's the other way around. And even, neoclassical economists who built real business cycle theory are the ones who argued this, that there's about a credit money, M2 minus M1, leads the cycle by about 3/4, base money follows by 1/4. So the timing is completely the opposite of the conventional model, but the same as the predictions from the endogenous money school. So exogenous money is saying that fundamentally the money supply is under the control of the Federal Reserve, the government, etc., which is why when you have the ISLM model, you have the idea of a vertical money supply to form the LM half, because that's supposed to be something controlled outside the system. So the government can put that vertical money supply anywhere it likes. The endogenous money case, on the other hand, says that money is primarily, but not exclusively, determined by the system itself, by the market economy. Somehow the interrelations between firms and banks generate the amount of money in the system. So that's the fundamental proposition, that it's not determined mainly by the central bank, but it's mainly by the commercial system. Of course, there can be elements in which they both have an interaction, but it's not the causation, the simple causation of the standard model. And that means, of course, both the money supply can expand and contract when the government's trying to make it do the opposite, which we're seeing right now. And the credit money has a very different type of nature to fiat money. Obviously, there's credit money in the conventional model, but you have to really, if there's some independence of credit money from how government money works, then you've got to really understand what's happening with debt as well to understand the macroeconomy. So leaving debt out of thinking, which comes from the money multiplier and loanable funds model, could be a very, very wrong move empirically. And therefore, once you've got to look at levels of debt, you've also got to consider the financial sector when you're analysing macroeconomics, because conventional economic theory, again, nice neat division, finance on one side, economics on the other. That is not sustainable if endogenous money is the way the system actually works. Now, I'm saying, of course, empirically it is, the endogenous money case does stack up endogenously, but empirically, but you've still got to work out, what does that actually mean in terms of a theory that then explains adequately what you're seeing in the real world. And there's plenty of controversy that is still running through the area. It's far from homogeneous. Plenty of disputes. We seem to be finally getting a lot of these under control, which is a good thing. So I'm covering less disputes in this year's lectures than I have in previous years. But things like how do you define money? What definition do you use? Now that still is something which applies to, even if we're talking about exogenous money, explaining, what is the government controlling? If the government controls it. Endogenous money, what is money if money is generated by the financial system? How money originated? What came first, money or credit? Was the state necessary? And how, one of the ways to cover the idea of endogenous money, one of the initial ways which Basil Moore put forward, was that rather than the money supply being perfectly vertical, meaning it's completely under control of the government and independent of the market system, he drew completely horizontally and saying that the financial system will provide as much money as people demand. So there's no independent supply function for money, and one way to represent that was by drawing a horizontal line rather than a vertical one, and then a lot of fights were over how horizontal is the money supply. Is it slope up, slope down, whatever else? How does it actually expand and contract? And can government policy alone stop crises, which in the most extreme form of chartalism cases, you've got people saying there's no crisis that can't be solved by a big enough government deficit, that sort of argument, versus other cases saying, well, there are limitations to how effective the government can be. How you measure money. And of course, one other thing, do these disputes matter anyway? A lot of disputes, certainly when you've got a new area developing, a lot of what look like really important issues can turn out to be debates about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Later on, they end up being semantic rather than important. Well, let's look at the what is money thing. Now, all schools of thought will accept that money is a means of payment and a store of value. But if you look at what I covered with you for Hicks last week, of course he's saying, and Keynes himself saying, why, if you had a neoclassical vision of the world in which the future was perfectly predictable or there's no uncertainty, why would you have money as a store of value? Why not keep it in something that's actually gives you a return? So the Neoclassicals themselves are really stuck to looking at money being a means of payment. And if you read Vicky Chick's article, one of the ones you might get in a reading, you see Vicky, who's one of the people who's ended up developing endogenous money theory, nonetheless starting from this perspective of being a means of value and a store of payment. Now, if you look at Marx, on the other hand, going right outside both neoclassical and to some extent post-Keynesian reading, Marx has always argued that the market economy is about the accumulation of wealth. Yes, you have to produce use values, but he said the real mode in capitalism is to accumulate as much wealth as possible. And for that, the store of value and money being a unit of account are crucial, because what's mattering to capitalists is not how much they consume, but what they accumulate. I remember seeing, probably find it on the web if you have a good look, somebody doing a calculation of what would have happened to Bill Gates if Bill Gates attempted to consume all the money he'd accumulated before he became a philanthropist and started giving it away over a lifetime that you might expect him to have. And I think he exploded about something like no matter what you tried to consume, he'd be crushed by it, blown up by it, etc., in a matter of, not, it wasn't quite milliseconds, but it was pretty damn fast. There's no way capitalists at that end are accumulating for the sake of consumption. They're accumulating to accumulate wealth, and therefore for that, you've got to have money as a unit of account, as a way of storing value. And his beautiful proposition of saying that if you model capitalism and argue that it's about satisfying the needs of the immediate consumers, you're never going to understand capitalism. So he's making the emphasis that the unit of account and the store of value are essential. And of course, one thing about money is a store of value. It's an accurate store, but it's intangible at the same time. You have billions of dollars, and it's all stored in one entry in a bank account. Whereas to have wealth in the past, you had to have, if you want to have wealth as an accumulation of commodities, you've got to have a warehouse somewhere. So money is the ultimate form, in that sense, of way of storing accumulation of wealth. Now, the origin of money. This is what I'm going to start by saying, is it all that important? I think it's an interesting issue, and one of my good colleagues, Michael Hudson, is one of the world's experts on how money originated, him and his co-worker, Cornelius Wunsch. Cornelius is one of the few people on the planet who could not only read ancient Sumerian texts written in clay tablets, she can actually speak the language. So she's one of the people, really researching where did we actually find money originated, because Sumerian culture is really the culture that was the initial human culture to have sophisticated writing, to have even developing the wheel, horse-drawn transport, etc., apparently all dates back to the Sumerians. Now, a lot of people talking in the area of monetary theory really focus on where did money originate to explain how it functions now. And I think, well, maybe that's feasible, but at the same time, if you looked at the same thing in aerodynamics, if you think 500 years into where we could be 500 years in the future, hopefully, if we ever get to the stage of generally exploring space properly, then by that time, aerodynamics, which are an essential part of how you design a craft to fly, would be irrelevant, because most of the flight would be in a vacuum. So, maybe the nature of the original nature isn't that important looking at today, but you do find that people who have particular beliefs about the role of money now and how it came about and what's essential in the way you analyze money today, it's tied up with what they believe is the way that money originated. And if you look at neoclassicals, their idea is that it originated in barter. We used to, exchange, clubs for spears, or, fish for grass skirts. And then we finally worked out if we actually used an intermediary, it would make it easier. So we started off in barter, we ended up in money. Now, endogenous money, there are two large positions. One is that money originated in commercial exchange. So if you take a look at how money came about, it was to record transactions between parties involved in some trading. Or the argument that was invented by the state for the payment of taxes. So rather than the state getting paid in pigs and corns of wheat, they said, instead pay us in this monetary unit we're inventing, and therefore you have to price everything, and it comes about through what the state did. So the latter approach is more the charterless position. The former approach emphasises the role of credit in monetary transactions and sees the state as, part of the whole thing, but not all that essential. Now, The idea that it arose out of barter, which is the neoclassical position, is what you can call a creation myth. It makes about as much sense in explaining money that way as to use Adam and Eve to explain evolution. Because when you look at the propositions, they were armchair logic. This is from Adam Smith, saying the division of labour, which is the complicated society we live in today, is the consequence of the innate propensity to truck and barter, which we all have. And he says you take it back to early humanity, you find that this has always been there, and it's common to humans, but doesn't happen with any other animal. Nobody ever saw a dog make a fair and deliberate exchange of one bone for another with another dog. So this is saying bartering is the essentially human characteristic in the same sense that intelligence is, or walking on two legs. Well, research by archaeologists and anthropologists suggests that rather than barter being the common form of human exchange in early societies and then evolving towards money, barter is extremely rare. There's very, very few examples of it, and it's normally between neighbouring social groups that are pretty antisocial towards each other and only meet very, very rarely, and they're on the verge of warfare. So in that situation, you found barter applying, but very, very rare, very unusual arrangement, because early on, most tribes neighbouring each other were at least hospitable, if not outright friendly. So within the early Cro-Magnon tribes out of which we evolved, they tended to be groups of about 150 or less people. Anything more than 150 would be dysfunctional in some way, and people would start to move into form another smaller group. And the way that goods were actually transferred were actually interpersonal gifts, fundamentally. Because we tend to forget we began as monkeys. Okay? We take ourselves back, we're a subspecies of simians. And if you look at how chimpanzees behave and gorillas behave and so on, and bonobos behave, that's the foundation we actually began and then diverged. So they're cooperative groups. They're not individuals like Tasmanian devils, for example, that roam independently and get together to eat carcasses or to have sex and then disappear again. We've always been a communal species. And when we developed the intelligence to get to the stage where we'd actually manufacture things, it appears that what we would do as part of the overall social bonding was to give these things as reciprocal gifts. So that's the nature in which exchange occurred. And of course, in doing that, if you gave somebody something, you didn't give it to you because you wanted to trade back. You gave it as part of your habit, an extension of friendship inside the very, very intimate groups we came out of. But of course, at the same time, if you did that and somebody didn't later reciprocate to you, and they consistently did it, you'd finally get to the stage where you'd find reasons not to make gifts with them. And you'd then have a form of division and breakdown of that particular person's relationships with you and perhaps with the rest of the culture. Think about what you do these days. I know one thing which is quite distinctive about driving in Sydney is if somebody's stuck, behind a parked car and they've got their indicator on, we'll often slow down and let them in, and then they drive into the stream and normally they'll wave the rear vision mirror, thanks. You've all done it, I imagine. How do you feel when somebody doesn't wave? Doesn't it bug you? Yeah, you get angry. You bastard, You're not doing it because you want the wave necessarily, but if you don't get it, you feel like you've been offended. That's really something I think very intrinsic, not just to how we drive in Sydney, but it's something about the nature of humanity. We want that feedback. So this is part of what you can find in these early societies. So with 150 people, you can keep track of who was actually being friendly, who was reciprocating, who wasn't. And this is part of the whole bonding process. So it wasn't barter. Fundamentally, it was credit, where we all kept in our minds a record of credit. But when you started getting bigger societies evolving once we invented agriculture, which is, again, the Sumerians apparently played a major role in that, then you had larger and larger populations beyond the 150 we couldn't keep track. And the credit relations began to be stored symbolically by writing them down as writing was developed as well. And these Sumerian tablets, which are beautifully covered in books like Graeber's Death the First 5,000 Years or Gleason White, The Double Entry, these were actually the way in which we'd record how the debts were stored, and they were firstly centralized in the early religions. Because the person you would most trust in your social group was the person who was the bastion of the religion, of whatever the collective belief was. And so it seems to be these early churches, but nothing like what we call churches today, early religions, you think, well, the old, if you think about witch doctors and stuff like that, you've got probably a better model of what's going on than if you think Cardinal Pell. Sometimes I wonder. You've got a fusion of religion and state and commerce all in one, because these would be institutions that both practiced the religion, were regarded as the central authorities at the same time, and had commercial components to them as well. So it's a very complex system. You can't just say it's state or commerce or religion. It's a blend of all three. But that's how the record keeping went from being all doing it individually to having one central authority in society being the one who we trusted to keep the records, which were then written down. So Graeber argues that credit came first. The origins of money were not in barter first, but credit first. And coins came out later when you started having social breakdown. We had large tribal groups now conflict with each other, military interventions. Maybe you can't trust the people you now find yourself in the same region as. Maybe the person who kept the records has been killed, etc., etc. So when that sort of thing's happening, you could no longer rely upon a central authority that you all trusted to keep the records. And then at that stage, coins and stuff began to come about. So wars and plunder were the origin of coins and money. They weren't the initial form in which money first came about. So when you said, and predatory lending appears to be worse when you've got coins rather than when you have interpersonal relations, credit recording everything. So intriguing insights from that point of view. Here's some examples for you. I was in Turkey not long ago. And this is the sort of stuff we're talking about. Now that object there is about, from memory, it's about 5 centimetres, 4 centimetres across. You're looking at a tiny little object there. You can see how densely that's written. Okay? And the double entry book I mentioned there talks about how digging further back in time, this is actually 2,500 BC, so we're talking something 4,500 years old there. We're going further back again. What you find is, before writing developed, what people were making was clay pots, and they put little symbol. Oh, Dimitri, bloody hell, hang on a second. Mate, your timing is disastrous. I am in another lecture. Oh, bloody hell, this is going to go on YouTube, mate. You're going to cop this one. Hang on. Okay, bye-bye. Pardon me, this is good. Have you seen the show Capital Account? Okay, Dimitri is a producer of Capital Accounts. If you haven't seen Russia Today Capital Account, do take a look. It's a great show. I'll just shut this down here because that's going to happen again. Okay, back to Samaria. Cool. Okay, here's another instance. This is a debt note dealing with a debt of 2/3 of a mina and 7 1/4 shekels of silver, which is 218 grams of silver, whatever that works out to in modern pricing, I'm not sure, owed by a couple to be paid to the creditor by a particular festival, and there's 2 silver receipts and 2 stamps belonging to the witnesses and debtors respectively. So it's all recording the debts. Now, I just went back to before Dimitri interrupted me there. The early societies had clay pots, and they'd be putting little symbols inside, which were related with one of the symbols would represent a pig, another would be wheat, etc., etc. And they were stored inside clay pots. And then over time, what we realized is you could actually then write those things on the outside of the cylinder rather than even put them inside an actual cylinder. And then finally, technology was to use a lump of clay and write them on clay with language. So this is the evolution of language, money, etc. It's fascinating stuff to read. I do recommend those 2 books. And here's another example of the sort of laws. One thing Graeber emphasizes is that a lot of these laws, the quantification began in talking about penalties. So having actual prices, set down prices for things, wasn't a case of working out a relative exchange rate between, corn and pigs. He was saying, if, for example, this one I've got here, if anyone blinds a free man in a quarrel, he shall give 1 mina of silver. And for some reason, I don't know what the hell this means. If only his hand does wrong, he shall give 20 shekels. The next one, if anyone blinds a slave in a quarrel, he shall give 20 shekels. Then if anyone knocks out the teeth of a free man, 2 teeth or 3 teeth, he gives 12 shekels. If a slave, he shall give 6 shekels. Okay? This is a real society. People living in this society were your forebears. These would be the actual laws people had to live with 2,500 years before. That's 2,000 years BC, so 4,000 years ago. Yeah. Yeah, the wealthy can smack you in the face and get away with it. What else has changed? Okay. Here's another one. This is 19th century, old in Assyrian now. So talking about how this is actually a debt contract. There's a line of silver and copper, and here's the interest rate stated in the document. So they were all using written down debts initially, forms of credit, and of course this is you're getting to society which are now having levels of breakdown and so on. So we've now got coins developed, and this is saying this is the legal control over the amount of coins to be transferred. So that's where we all came from. Back to slightly more recent, somebody will fight over, and that's Keynes on money. Of course, most people who work in endogenous money were inspired by Keynes, but Keynes himself was confusing on what he actually thought about money. And this was partly because if you read just the general theory, it's a very difficult book to read for many reasons, but one of the most important ones is, as Keynes himself wrote in the preface, writing the book was a long struggle of escape from habitual modes of thought and expression. Now, he still hasn't completely escaped. He thought he had, but he certainly hadn't. So lots of old ideas were still written in there as if they were new ideas. And if you take the whole lot together, I think you can get very confused. And Keynes would also do what I find myself doing occasionally. That was what Dimitri's writing to me about, an article in Forbes allegedly critiquing my critique of competition theory. I'm actually going to hopefully write a reply on Forbes and say what my critique actually was in my competition theories, as I've told you guys, a load of nonsense. But anyway, Keynes would take some position that an opponent thought and then show the opponent was wrong, like I do with the idea of that model of mine of what actually a bunch of rational traders, producers would actually do. I see him rising marginal cost, which I don't believe applies, but I take that and show the outcome is not what a neoclassical thinks. Well, Keynes does the same thing occasionally as well. So it's very, very hard to work out what he actually believes out of the general theory. And you can find statements which are both clearly exogenous, like this one, where he talks about what the marginal efficiency of capital, and that itself is a very Hicksian neoclassical type idea. And he comes down to saying it depends upon 3 variables, the third one of which is the quantity of money as determined by the actions of the central bank. That's clearly exogenous money. No argument there at all. But you'll also find, on occasion, you'll say things like the amount of cash the banking system has created, which is ambiguous. And even further, in chapter 15, you'll say you can actually expand the amount of money by a relaxation of the conditions of credit, which implies it's the decision of the banking system itself rather than the central bank. So you've got all this confusion reading the general theory. Now, by 37, there's a substantial shift towards more endogenous money thinking in the way Keynes writes, and I'll talk about that later. But the key person at that time who was absolutely clear about endogenous money was actually Schumpeter. In many ways, I regard Schumpeter as a superior thinker to Keynes. Certainly made less logical errors, and he stuck with ideas more clearly. Now, he's known as the father of evolutionary economics, and that's the main thing people focus about, his argument that the economy should be seen as an evolutionary system. And in that, he made the entrepreneur his key agent of change, social change. And then saw that what the entrepreneur did was by bringing in a new idea would advance society what he called creative destruction. So you get a new commodity which would expand society's capabilities, but it would end up destroying effectively investments in other preceding technologies. So, for example, the way that we're seeing the tablet PC right now wiping out Netflix, for example. Fairly minor illustration there. But essential to his thinking was both credit and endogenous money. And that's not emphasised enough, I think, when we look at Schumpeter. And it started from the argument that banks can create money out of nothing. It's actually a quote from Schumpeter. Now, you'll see people like Krugman arguing that statements like that identify somebody as a crank. But no one in economics is going to call Schumpeter a crank. Whatever they might think of him, he's a very, very great intellect in economics, wrote one of several of the definitive books in economics, including probably the definitive history of economic thought at the time. So he's arguing, and he argues quite explicitly, that banks can create demand by lending money without reducing the spending power of savers. And that's clearly endogenous money. And he says, in fact, what banks are fundamentally, the important role they play, the productive role they play, is giving entrepreneurs the capacity to actually produce, to invest in the first place. And he sees credit as essential because the way he defines an entrepreneur is somebody with a good idea but no money. Now, of course, you have people who've got good ideas and they've got money. Okay? So he's saying, is they're making it difficult for himself. Take the pure entrepreneur. And the pure entrepreneur to him is somebody who's got a good idea but can't put it into effect because they don't have any money. Therefore, they've got to borrow the money to be able to put their idea into effect. And they get that power, that borrowing power, by borrowing money from a bank. So again, he's refining the function of banks. You can find instances where entrepreneurs get money from somebody who's a venture capitalist who themselves has borrowed that money from a bank or got it in some debt-financed way. So it can be more complex than that. I just actually had a lovely illustration of this when I was in New Zealand. I met William Moore, who is actually the inventor of FPOS. And he told me about how he'd gone about the invention, which is just working out as electrical engineer, that if he made a circuit board that took the electrical signals coming out the back of a cash register, he could then use that to derive what the transactions were, which then would mean you could do it without needing about a dozen clerical staff to keep record of the transactions in a shop. And he said he's making these for about, the cost of the components he had to wire up, circuit boards and resistors and stuff, was about $80 to $100. And it then turned out every time he sold one of these things to a shop, the shop would almost always buy a mini computer afterwards. The mini computer that was normally sold at the time was used by a company called DEC, and it was called the PDP-11. So finally the PDP-11 salesman, of the manager, tracked him down and said, look, every time we sell one of these things, you sell one of these, we sell one of our machines. Why don't we sell it for you? We'll bundle it together. And, then he said, so we want to buy it off you. And he's smart enough to say, oh, okay, how about I sell it for twice what it cost me? He didn't. He said, oh, what do you think it's worth? The guy says, oh, well, we sell the decks for about 25. How about 11,000? So he's getting $11,000 for $80 circuit board. Not a bad margin. Okay? That's how his business began. Now, fundamentally, he's going a bit beyond the example that Schumpeter is going through here, but he was getting his spending power by being provided by somebody else. Okay? And fundamentally what Schumpeter is saying is, in fact, the ideal situation, the archetypal situation he's working on is where the entrepreneur has to get money by approaching a bank and persuading the bank that the idea is a good idea. There's no money, so they're not financed by selling goods and services now, Schumpeter's entrepreneurs. He says, therefore, if they're getting money from the banks without getting money from their own savings or from other people's savings, total credit must be greater than if it were fully covered. Now, it's quite confusing in how he states this. By fully covered credit, he means money from selling goods and services. By total credit, he means that plus the monetary demand being generated by banks giving loans to entrepreneurs. So he says banks provide the credit they need. So where do entrepreneurs get the money? They need to be able to take existing technology, existing labour, and produce something new. He said, well, people normally say they get it from savings. This is the conventional case. So entrepreneurs are financed because other people save money. He said, well, yes, that's possible, but by far the greater part of it doesn't come from thrift, it comes from something else again. Because if you've actually had abstaining from consumption, for a start that would be a small part of what would actually be available. There's not a lot of abstaining from consumption that goes on in our society. So if you said if that was the case, there'd only be a small amount, and there'd be less incentive to save anyway. So there wouldn't be a great reservoir of free purchasing power if all you could do to fund the entrepreneur was to abstain from consuming yourself. They said what actually happens instead is that banks create new spending power out of nothing without sacrificing the spending power of savers. And that therefore means entrepreneurs add to the demand that's already existing in society rather than taking away from it. So he goes through this whole argument and says that even the conventional answer is not obviously absurd, Okay, so it's not so absurd you can rule it out prima facie that savings finances entrepreneurs. You said there's another form which you can regard as really the strictly only available form that adds to capacity, and that's the creation of purchasing power by banks, not by transforming someone else's purchasing power to another person, but by creating new purchasing power out of nothing. That's fundamentally the vision of endogenous money, and it's in Schumpeter. Now, Schumpeter was Minsky's PhD student. There's a very direct lineage between what Schumpeter developed and Minsky's ideas as well. And Minsky argued that rising debt was an essential part of a growing capitalist economy. He said if you're going to have the macroeconomy expanding, then aggregate demand must be rising most of the time. He said for that to be true, current spending has to be greater than currently received income. And there has to be some way to balance that all out. He said it follows, therefore, that when growth is taking place, at least some sectors finance part of their spending by emitting debt or selling assets, but fundamentally by emitting debt. So you have an argument that aggregate demand is greater than current received income. And that's getting towards what even some post-Keynesians still regard as an error. But it's not, and I'll explain why. So Marx also had similar arguments about capitalists in particular being people whose excess demands were actually negative. They want to put in less money than they get out. He said if a capitalist doesn't do that, then he's not going to be a capitalist. You've got to actually put in less than you get back out again. So rather than trying to get equality between your supply and demand, which is the usual while raising an argument, the aim is to get the inequality between them as great as possible. All these visions here about trying to gaps, not equilibrium, but gaps. And bank debt is what finances that gap. So expanding debt is a basic feature of a growing capitalist economy. And here you have them arguing banks creating enough money out of nothing and not just being intermediaries and adding money to aggregate demand. Whereas the neoclassical vision, the banks are just intermediaries. They just transfer money from savers to borrowers. And that's what Krugman's argued recently in a bit of a debate with me. It's a bit polite calling it debate. It was more of a slanging match. But he said that I asserted that putting banks in the story is essential. And I just love these two lines because it means I no longer have to assert to people who don't know economics that neoclassical economists don't include banks, debt and money in their models, because Krugman says it. He says, why are banks so crucial to a story about debt and leverage? That's a very, very different vision of banks. Minsky and Schumpeter, they're crucial, and expanding debt's a fundamental part of a capitalist economy. Neoclassical economics, you can model the economy and you can ignore the existence of banks and debt and money. And at this stage, when he's going through his first argument, he actually accurately described what I believe, which is unlike what he did later. But he said Keynes asserts that lending is by definition an addition to aggregate demand. So I don't get that at all, he says. And here's a neoclassical vision of what money is all about. If I decide to cut back on my spending and stash the funds in a bank, which lends them out to someone else, this doesn't have to represent a net increase in demand. It's possible, of course, that the borrower is more of a spendthrift than the saver. That's what you expect. But he said, but I'm saying something else, and he's not quite certain what it is. But I think he has something to do with the notion that creating money equals creating demand. He said, again, that isn't right in any model I understand. And that's completely accurate all the way down the line, including he doesn't understand models where it can happen. So his model of money is like this. You have a patient agent who saved a lot of money, an impatient agent with nothing, and the patient agent lends to the impatient agent. And then, of course, there've got to be interest payments and stuff, and you hope the impatient agent is going to do something with the money. But in that particular case, the patient agent's spending power is going to fall, the impatient spending power will rise, and there's no overall change in aggregate demand. It'll be marginal change if they have different marginal propensities to consume. It won't be a fundamentally increase in demand. And you can ignore banks, so they're just acting as an intermediary in that particular arrangement. So that gives you a prediction. And that is that private debt is normally irrelevant to macroeconomics. And this is again what Krugman argues quite eloquently from a neoclassical point of view. So he says, to a first approximation, debt is money we owe to ourselves. You go inside our own country. We as Americans owe to Americans, Japanese to Japanese. So therefore, the overall level of debt makes no difference to aggregate net worth, one person's asset liability to another person's asset. So it follows that the level of debt matters only if the distribution of net worth matters. Okay? So only debt, the aggregate level of debt is unimportant. All that matters is that it can only be important if there are highly indebted players and they've got different constraints from lowly indebted players or ones that actually save money. So only if there's something to make the distribution of debt matter do you need to worry about debt at all. Otherwise you can ignore it in macroeconomics and of course banks as well. And then when you've got rising debt, that's not the case. The economy as a whole is borrowing more money. It's rather, and this is the whole reason why I use patient and impatient, a case of less patient people borrowing from more patient people. Now, who do you think is a better person, the patient person or the impatient person? Who votes for patient people being better than impatient people? Who votes the other way around? It's pejorative, isn't it? Patient, impatient, like a whole lot of neoclassical terminology. Perfect, imperfect, rational, not rational. There's a lot of pejorative terms tied up in how the language they use. Anyway, continue. Said, so the only limit here isn't the actual amount of money, it's whether patient people think they're going to get repaid. And that said some sort of limit on how much can be lent. That's the argument he's got. That's from his most recent book. Now, the endogenous money vision is very, very different. It doesn't have patient and impatient at all. What it has is entrepreneur and bank. Not quite so pejorative. So the entrepreneur approaches a bank and says, I've got a great idea. I need some money to put into effect. The bank says, we like the idea. Here's $1 million. By the way, you owe us $1 million. So simultaneous creation on both the asset and the liability side of the banking sector. And this is the argument that Schumpeter makes, that gives purchasing power in the first case no new goods correspond. So rather than selling goods to get the money, it's being created by the bank. And he said the essential role of credit is transferring purchasing power to the entrepreneur, but not the transfer of existing purchasing power. So it's not saver to lender from Schumpeter's point of view. And that gives you, the new loan puts additional spending power into circulation without reducing the spending power of savers. So that gives you an argument that aggregate demand exceeds demand from income alone. I've been putting that so far from both Schumpeter and Minsky. Now, that is a very, very different argument to neoclassical. Here's Schumpeter, here's Minsky on the same point. The neoclassical says private debt plays no role at all, except the only time it actually will play is when there's a liquidity trap, which means you can't get interest rates low enough to encourage people who are by nature savers to actually spend more money to balance a reduction in spending by people who are normally debtors. So those are the two cases. Now, I'm just going to say, can the data tell us which one is right? Can we actually look at the data and make some sort of decision on it? Well, the endogenous money case is that, instead of something by Schumpeter and Minsky, the change in debt adds to aggregate demand. And that would therefore mean that change in debt affected macroeconomic performance all the time, not just during the liquidity trap. Whereas the neoclassical cases, banks are just intermediaries between savers and borrowers, and in normal times, when there isn't this liquidity trap, a change in debt won't have any macroeconomic impact. So I can make a prediction from the endogenous money point of view to say that change of debt will correlate strongly with unemployment, because if there's an increase in debt, that means the entrepreneurs can hire more people, and by hiring more people, they drive down the unemployment rate. So I'm going to expect a strong negative correlation between change in debt and the level of unemployment, for example. Whereas the neoclassical prediction was, it's not going to matter. Change in the aggregate level of debt, not individual now, but aggregate level of debt, will only matter when there's something artificial happening that means that the effect of the change in debt on savers is not balanced by the effect of a change of debt on borrowers. So here's the data, and I'm now going back and looking in nominal terms and going back over 90 years, going on 100 years of data. And you can see the private debt was greater than GDP until just during the Second World War. Then you had a period where private GDP was greater than private debt, but in about 1970, the growth rate of private debt was such that it ended up substantially exceeding the level of GDP. So it's gone from a ratio back here of 100% of GDP to a ratio here of 300%. There's only two times, or two major times, where there was a fall in the level of private debt. First coincides with the 1930 to 45 period, both the Great Depression and the Second World War, and the second is now. Those are the only two times over that whole historic period. This little bit here, by the way, is the glitch courtesy of joining together two different data series, one annual data on debt from the census, the other quarterly data from the Federal Reserve when it began to record the flow of funds. So both those periods happen to coincide with depressions. So there's two potential explanations. Those are unique periods, and liquidity trap applies, or they're an extension of what normally happens when debt always matters. That's what I want to compare. That's, by the way, looking at the debt ratio now. That's the same data, but I'm now looking at it in terms of dividing nominal debt by nominal GDP to get the red line, and the blue line happens to be government debt. Just a little aside, I'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but this is the one politicians are obsessing about. This is the one I think matters. So Schumpeter is now talking about debt mattering because the entrepreneur can make a profit out of borrowing the money, and money matters. He's got money playing an essential role and banks being essential, and supply and demand not leading to a market in equilibrium. So all sorts of reasons why Volrite law, another important neoclassical concept, is overturned in a dynamic setting, and linking finance and economics together. So you've got this summary that aggregate demand equals income plus change in debt. I'm mainly contrasting it with neoclassical, but the allegation I get from, not just from neoclassical, also from a lot of post-Keynesians, is double counting going on. Because doesn't somebody's debt become somebody's income after it's spent? So aren't I counting it twice to have change of debt plus income in that equation? But once I'm counting as a change in debt, and then I'm also counting it as income, I'm doing double counting. And if you look at the recorded data, you get an absolute equality of expenditure and income. So one person's spending becomes another person's income. And it's actually true. That's all correct. But it's not inconsistent with saying aggregate demand equals income plus change in debt. So I'll take you through the logic of that after I go through the stats first of all. That's why I want to show that what I'm putting forward is not illogical. It looks that way. It looks like double counting, but I'll show you why it's not later. So if the conventional case were true, then I'd generally find no impact of changes in the level of total private debt, except when there's a special circumstance like now, when the rate of interest is zero. This is Keynes' argument. He's saying that, oh, hang on, I'm doubling my... I've done a bit of fast editing. Obviously, I didn't knock that out properly at the right time. That later. My apologies. Let's flick over that. So he says debt matters now because we're in a liquidity trap. And his explanation of why debt matters now. They said we had a period of too much optimism, where debtors borrowed and spent too much money. And since one person's assets is another person's liability, to actually get that extra increase in lending, you have to offer a high rate of interest. So he's arguing there's a positive correlation between the rate of growth of debt in real terms and the real interest rate. Then people who are borrowing money remembered the dangers of debt, and they went from leveraging up to leveraging. So people who are borrowing money and therefore spending more than their income are now spending less than their income. So if you're going to get balance, what you need is to have the people who used to save now becoming spenders. He said you can't get real interest rates low enough to encourage people who are by nature patient to spend to match the lack of spending now by people who are by nature impatient. So therefore you hit liquidity trap, and then he argues in favour of fiscal policy to slow down the adjustment that has to happen as the debtors slowly reduce their income, their debt levels. So that says distribution matters, and therefore you can end the crisis by having a large enough government deficit or by raising the inflation rate. That's all that's necessary. And his new book has this emphatic title, End this Depression Now. In other words, it's just a case of a simple adjustment to either change the real interest rate or to make up for the deleveraging by the private debtors by having more government spending, and the depression will be over. I think depression is gratuitous, and we get into it quickly and more easily, and the whole idea is we need more government spending, and that'll fix the problem, just like it did back in the Great Depression. Now I agree with the need for deficits now, but I'm just going to look at that diagnosis. Is the liquidity trap explanation adequate? Because that would argue, to start first of all, this proposition that you need high real interest rates to encourage a high rate of growth of debt, but the important one, that the change in debt will only matter in a liquidity trap. That's the neoclassical hypothesis. Well, let's look at the first one about real interest rates. Do high real interest rates cause high, or are they correlated with high real debt growth? If you take a look at the real change in debt, so change in debt divided by the CPI, and the real interest rate, the same story, then you find, well, yep, there's the rate cut to 0.25%, that's the zero lower bound, and the correlation is positive. And there is a correlation between high levels of real interest rates and high rates of growth of debt. So that's maybe feasible. Funnily enough, it's actually a stronger correlation after the zero lower bound than beforehand. When the Federal Reserve is now, when you take a look at the Federal Reserve rate of 0.125% and subtract the inflation rate from it of about 2%, you get a negative reserve rate of interest. But of course, we don't pay the reserve rate. We pay at least 3% higher as borrowers. So they've still got a positive nominal interest rate. And according to Krugman, it should be ineffective past that point. So to find the correlation is actually stronger is strange. And if you take a look beforehand, you've still got a positive correlation, but it's not all that strong, 0.121, a fairly low correlation. So I'd say that particular, the first hypothesis got weakly confirmed by the data, not a strong one at all. But then change in debt only has impact during liquidity trap. Well, here's the data, the unemployment rate and the change in debt. And to make it easier to see the correlations, because it's a negative correlation, I've turned the unemployment rate upside down. So that's zero unemployment up there. That's 13% down here. Now, one look at the diagram and you can see his proposition is wrong, because his hypothesis is I'm only going to find a strong correlation in that direction on this side of the zero lower bound. Over that side, there'll be no correlation worth noticing. Well, blind Freddy, see there's a correlation there that matters. The correlation after the zero lower bound is weak, not a strong correlation. That's the one that Krugman thought would be strong. The correlation over the entire time period is actually far from being zero. It's a fairly strong correlation. It's much more powerful than you could find for the real interest rate relationship. And if you look before the zero lower bound, it's actually stronger still. So rather than being zero, which you'd need for the loanable funds neoclassical debt doesn't matter argument, it's substantially, significantly different than zero. So rather than mattering only after the zero lower bound, it matters least after then, matters at all times. So I'm arguing his hypothesis is false. It's neat, it's plausible, and it's wrong. There's a wonderful statement by Thomas Huxley about this, a great tragedy of science, slaying of a beautiful hypothesis by an ugly fact. Well, frankly, economics needs more of that. Okay? Because he's pushing this argument all the time. Look at it empirically, it doesn't stand up. What about the alternative that actually came out of empirical data? The change in debt matters at all times because somehow, and I haven't explained how yet, it adds to aggregate demand. Well, I'm partially confirming it by that previous correlation, but I want to go further now because to properly measure it, what I'm actually arguing, what Schumpeter argued and Minsky argued as well, is that the change in debt adds to demand. Well, demand is aggregate demand from selling goods and services is gross domestic product. So I have to scale the change in debt by gross domestic product rather than looking at the percentage rate of change of debt. Because if you go back to 1970, a 10% change in debt was a 10% addition to aggregate demand if my argument is correct, because at that stage the debt to GDP ratio is 100%. Now, fast forward to 2009, and a 10% change in debt was actually equivalent to 30% of GDP. Much, much different. When you take a look at the data over time, you can see it very clearly. Here's the black dotted line is the debt to GDP ratio, plotted on the right-hand scale. The red line is the percentage rate of change of debt per annum. The blue line is that same rate of change of debt divided by GDP. And you can see back here much the same sort of thing. But when you get to the peak level of debt, when it cracked 300%, the change in debt was 30% of GDP versus a 10% change in the actual debt level. Debt was $42 trillion. Debt rose by 4.5 trillion at that time, so just over a 10% change. But GDP was 14 trillion. So the change in debt was 4.5 trillion, which is about 30% of GDP. So you've got to deflate by GDP rather than by just by percentage rate of change. So here's now looking at that same data again, but showing the change in debt as a percentage of GDP rather than as a percentage of itself. And the correlation, minus 0.63 after the zero lower bound, so quite strong, stronger than what Krugman found with his percentage rate of change, or could be found for Krugman's argument. minus 0.76 between 1980 and now, which is very strong, and before the zero low bound, minus 0.84, and significance levels off the scale. Okay. Significantly different from zero, monumentally so. So, looking at the stats, the argument strongly contradicts the argument that money at the level that doesn't matter. Empirically, it matters at all times, and you need an alternative theory, which is the post-Keynesian proposition that money supply is endogenous, and that the not just post-Keynesian argument now, this is narrower than post-Keynesian. The argument defined in Schumpeter and Minsky and Marx and Keynes and me, that aggregate spending is income plus change in debt. And I therefore have to explain why. Now let's take a break at that point. I'll go back to colonial funds for a bit after that. It's going to be a long lecture, so a bit longer coming up. Take a bit of a break, have a cup of coffee and come back.